Excellent. As usual, I will send these slides and the recording through to you after today's session. Hopefully, useful session today. We'll talk about, a lot of these sessions are based on how do we start to take more of a coaching leadership style. Today really is about how do we master leadership through like world-class coaching. And when I say world-class coaching, I guess I'm really talking about the GROW model. So we'll talk about that in today's session. As usual, these are an opportunity, hopefully, just to give you some thinking space in the busyness of what is a 4-day week for us this week with the bank holiday, but an opportunity to slow things down and hopefully think a bit more clearly about some of the things you're doing, perhaps some of the things you're seeing and experiencing with your teams, and potentially, making some adjustments to the way that you're leading them. And we'll look at why coaching. I know you're both kind of been to a few of these sessions, so you'll know why coaching, but we'll talk about why using coaching. We'll talk about how to start using coaching, then we'll work through the GROW model. And I've got just a slight adjustment to the GROW model, which is a final step. So hopefully that will be useful for you today to start to think about how does that potentially play a role in your coaching conversations with your teams. And then we'll open it up as usual to discussion, feedback. I've got a few things I'll share, and then we'll wrap up and close before 10 o'clock this morning. It might be a bit quicker this morning if there's just the three of us, but that's okay. I wanted to share this picture. This is me at, I think I was 21, and I was just about to start a sales role. That was the first tie I ever bought as like an adult. And I remember starting in sales and thinking, literally as soon as I was in, working for a sales manager, I thought actually sales management leadership, that's probably where I'd like my career to go, but I didn't quite know how to get there. And then the first couple of years I was in sales, I'd had some interesting experiences because the company I worked for literally gave me a set of car keys, 11 yellow pages. They did me a factory tour of where they produce some of their products, and then said, that's your territory, figure it out. And so for the first 6 months, that's what I did. And what I recognized probably about a year in was that I was doing a lot of pitching and not really getting as far in the conversations with customers as I should be. And it wasn't until I got a couple of years in, and then I'd been okay as a salesperson at that point. And then I got an opportunity to go to a much bigger company and moved jobs. And as soon as the first thing they did, I had like a 6-week ITC, introductory training course. First thing they did was put me on a sales training course. And it was like, that's why I need to make the changes that I need to make. That is the difference that it kind of made to my approach. And a lot of it was about the questions that I asked. Started to take a question-led approach to sales rather than a go in and say as much as you can and hope something lands. So kind of pray and spray approach. And that made a real difference. And then I kind of forward on about 4 years later, and I kind of went through another change, which was I went into my first leadership role. I've been wanting to be a sales manager for so long that when I had my first opportunity at it, within 6 months, I felt like this, because I kind of made the mistakes that I'd made as a salesperson then as a leader. Rather than coaching, I was, directing and saying to people, this is how it needs to be done, and kind of pushing and cajoling people, thinking that was the only way to do it because I've never had any leadership development. And I went on for probably about a year. And then I had a conversation with the national sales manager. I was one of the regional sales managers at the time. And we had this conversation where I said, look, I don't know if I can do this anymore. It's absolutely wearing me out. I've got resistance from the team. I'm getting all sorts of problems and challenges. I still was managing a small territory, so I was territory based, and I had some leadership responsibility. And we had an agreement. It took us a few months. We had an agreement. I'll go back into a strategic sales role, which I did for a couple of years. And then the general sales and marketing manager of the business said to me, look, why don't we, while you're back into this leadership key account, strategic account management role, why don't we get you some coaching on leadership so that in the future, if you want to go back into leadership, you've got this, you've got some structure and you've got some development that you've had. And that was the key change for me. And then I took on a couple of direct reports, did it kind of step by step, and then went into a full national sales management role. And it was knowing the kind of leadership playbook. What are the things that we can pull out that will work in leadership, the same way that we need to know that in sales, that really made a difference. And And so that kind of brings me on to the model. And you've heard me talk about this model. And what I did after leaving the corporate world about 6 years ago was really start to pull together all the different tools, all the different strategies, principles that I'd used in leadership that had made me successful as a leader over time, and said, actually, if you could roadmap it, what would it look like? And that's where this model has come from. Making sure that people trust you and you have relationships, and think about how do you do that intentionally rather than just being everybody's friend, because sometimes you have to have relationships that are more challenging than that, because you can't be friends with everybody. Not everybody's going to like you, but actually, as long as everybody respects you and you have credibility, that's what's important. And then making sure there's a clear plan for the business so that you can articulate that and people can align with something and they feel as if they're part of something bigger. Then contracting with people, have an agreement about how you work, setting standards, agreeing boundaries, helping people to understand what's acceptable and what's not. And that sounds so obvious for high performers and leaders, but for a lot of team members, I found the times when I hadn't had these contracting conversations, we'd have sales conferences. I was managing a business at one point. We'd have a sales conference, and you get people that would get so ridiculously drunk that their behavior would be absolutely off the charts. And you kind of think you can't deal with it in that moment. But what you can then do is pick up a contracting conversation that talks about how those behaviors are not acceptable. It's not part of our culture. It's not aligned with our values. But if you have them in advance, if you tell people these things, if people understand these in advance, you still get the odd rogue outlier, but most of the time they tend to correct themselves. So contracting is really important. Objectives and goals, clarity is the number one engagement indicator. When you look at engagement surveys in businesses, how clear am I about what's expected of me? Number one thing that engages employees. So objectives and goals are probably the pinnacle for everybody. And then creating some space for people to do great work and observe them, right? So action and observation is really important, especially in sales leadership roles, where we talk about a lot of the time we're talking about quantity and metrics. How many sales calls are you doing? How big's your pipeline? How many opportunities are you working through? Are you progressing them? All that good stuff that's important. But the qualitative part of sales leadership is equally important, right? So are people structuring the call in the right way? Have they planned? Are they engaging the customer? Are they building rapport? Are they following a sales approach that works? And sometimes, we have to have some time observing people so that we can give them that feedback, because they can't often see it for themselves. So action observation is equally important. And from there, that's when coaching is like just so beneficial and so valuable. Once you've put this groundwork in, then when you coach, that's when everything transforms, because you're able to really get the kind of connection with people. They trust you to coach them. They lean into the coaching. They understand why you're doing it, and they're fully committed. And that's when coaching really makes a difference. And then the final bit is always, I'm always thinking about how do we continuously develop our people so they become better, because it's by people becoming better that the business thrives, grows. We get better connections with customers. We get better performance from everybody, and a rising tide lifts all ships, right? Everybody gets better. The business performance improves, and that was a big kind of light bulb for me when I was in lots of different leadership roles. That reinvestment in people so they keep getting better, and for us personally as leaders. So this already. A reminder: you can only coach people if you're able to kind of take a question-led approach, listen carefully to them, and create some space for thinking. A bit like these sessions, right? Create a bit of space so that people can slow down, start to relax a bit, and really explore what's inside them. What are their own kind of unique capabilities, and that's really, really important. Now, so in terms of coaching, we know the GROW model is the gold standard. I'll talk through that in a second. And the GROW model, I'm sure you know this already, was first introduced by Sir John Whitmore in the book Coaching for Performance, which is it's quite a heavy read, but it's a good read. And it talks through, how do you start to have those performance-based conversations in a way that is coaching-led, not directive. And that, the whole idea is to park ourselves in those conversations, think about the other person only. That might be, in this context, probably your team members, but it could be your peers. It could be your own line manager. It could be, somebody else in the business. It might be a customer, might be a stakeholder in the business, but you're kind of really focusing on the other person when you're having coaching conversations. I've already talked about rapport and having a relationship of trust. We have to have that in place. It was interesting. I was with a client team this week, and somebody mentioned to me that their first coaching conversation, their team member was kind of looking at them because they'd switched from directive management to coaching, and their team member was looking at them just blankly, as if to say, "What? Why aren't you telling me? Why aren't you telling me what to do? I know you know." And they had to kind of almost go really reverse out of that situation and say, actually, let's have a conversation about how we want these conversations to be in future, and almost go back to contracting to say this is a change in the dynamic of our relationship, because I'm trying not to just tell you what to do all the time, because it doesn't serve that person, and actually for the leader it doesn't feel that's empowering either. So sometimes you might have to reverse and just make sure that trust is there before you can coach. We want to slow down and create some thinking space and really expansive thinking. People, it's really interesting. I ran an exercise. We have an open cohort of coaching leaders. We did an exercise at our full day together in August, earlier this month, about 3 weeks ago. And everybody brought a really sticky business scenario with them, something they're working on that they just can't nail. And we did groups of 3, and we did coaching conversations. We had an observer, a coach, and someone being coached, the client. And it was fascinating. So half an hour deep coaching session, and then they rotated. And the feedback from people, the clarity they got just through having a half an hour coaching conversation, where all they were exposed to was questions, right? Just questions following the grow model. And it just helped them to unlock so many different ideas and so much more potential than they'd thought, because they'd never really given themselves the clear thinking space for the problem that they're working on. And of course, it's about questioning, listening, but also challenging perspectives. Sometimes challenging perspectives, just playing back something to someone that they've said. So that's not possible because. And if you just play that back to someone, so what you're saying is that's not possible because. And when they hear someone else say it, sometimes they can see it for what it is, which is just a barrier that they've put up themselves. It's really interesting as a technique, almost reflecting back to people. And of course, in coaching, with coaching conversations, it's also about trusting your intuition and the experience you have as a leader, but also as an operator in your business. And I'm really a fan of signposting, not directing or telling. So even, I have coaching conversations all the time. I was with a couple of clients this week where one-to-one coaching clients with some very senior people. And, to be honest with you, they're more senior than I ever got to in my organizations. So actually, I can't advise them because I've not been through what they're going through. But what I can do is coach. And sometimes, a signpost might be just pausing and saying, can I make a suggestion? They say, yes. Can I suggest that you might think about this? And they'll say, okay, yeah. And then we go back to coaching, right? So what does that mean for you? When you think about that, how could you use that? And it's really interesting that builds independence. And when you're dealing with highly capable people, you want to build independence, right? Because they don't always want to be told what to do. They'd much rather figure it out for themselves. And coaching allows you to help them do that. And then the other bit that's always been really useful for me is this understanding that when we coach people and we help them to figure out things for themselves, what happens in the brain is really interesting. That when people make decisions and they spend time thinking, and then they say, oh, well, that equals that, what happens in the mind, what happens in the brain, is that they create these neural pathways that help that person to, once they've established that link, they can then take that into the future and say, right, this is something I now know and can repeat and replicate again. Whereas when we tell people what to do, the neural pathways never formed. They just go off and do it. And when they come back again, it might be a month, it might be a couple of months later, they haven't remembered what it was that they'd done before because they hadn't come up with it. So, we talk about change coming from the inside out. This is why it's important, because we want people to make those neural pathway links for themselves, so it creates capability for the future. That's one of the big things around coaching. So let's talk through the grow model, and then we'll have a discussion. So you know this already. Hopefully it's a good refresher for you. There's an extra stage that I use, which I'll talk you through. So the grow model is G is the goal. And the reason, if you read Coaching for Performance, the reason it starts with goal is because most people are very often rooted in the problem. And the whole idea is that in the start of a coaching conversation, you might say, what's the topic you want to talk to about today? So they might say, I've got this problem with a customer, I've got this problem with a team member, I've got this problem with another department, or whatever they say, right? And let people explain this is the situation. But once the situation's out, then the first question should be, using the GROW model, okay, what outcome do you want? Or what do you want instead? What's the goal of this conversation? And that's really interesting, because very often for people, they haven't thought about that. They're so rooted in the problem. When you ask them what do you want instead, they won't always be able to describe it. Once we understand the goal, then we go to reality. And it might take a bit of time to tease out the goal, because people, as I say, haven't always given it the time and thinking space that they require. So then we say, okay, where are we now? What's been happening? And then we go to options. Once you understand everything about the current situation, or they've been able to articulate it, you don't necessarily need to understand it. They just need to articulate it. Then you can ask them about options. Okay, what are the options that you have going forward? And once you've explored options, then it's about a willingness. What will you do? So make a decision. What are the things you can now do instead? And got some examples of questions. So for goal, what's the goal? What's the ideal outcome? I've used this with team members in the past. Describe what high performance means to you. If you're not coaching on a topic, if you're just trying to coach them to think differently or think about their own performance, so describe what high performance means to you. Really interesting, because that's one of those questions that, again, for your top 10 to 20% of people, they'll know and they'll talk about it. But performance happens in a bell curve, and as you go further down the bell curve, this question is really interesting because it challenges people to think differently, because they haven't thought about it. They kind of see themselves as middle table performers, and when you ask them what high performance means to you or what it looks like to you, it can really shift their thinking. And then reality is about the here and now. Where are you now? What have you tried so far, or what's your performance like so far? What's working for you? What has worked? What hasn't worked for you? What have you tried? What haven't you tried? Which is really interesting, because that helps people to kind of get grounded in especially the what haven't you tried up until now, or what I haven't done is, and they'll tell you, which is interesting. And that very often, those two steps in the process will already get people shifting their thinking. And then, of course, we go into options. So what are your options? And, it's their options, not yours. It's about them. What could you do differently? What would you do if success were guaranteed? Is quite a nice one for options, because then sometimes it just unlocks something. If you're guaranteed to succeed at doing something, what would you do? What would a high performer do? So we start them thinking about, if they're not in that high performance bracket, what do you think a high performer would do? You might reference people in the organization. You might reference somebody that's been promoted, or whatever the situation is, and that can really help people shift in thinking. And then finally, of course, what will you do? And I'm a fan of what will you do? When will you do it? What do you need to do to fully commit to yourself? And that because very often, if we don't get the commitment really clear, people are left a little bit vague, and then they don't always follow through. And then, depending on whether or not this is your style or not, I will often ask people, how will I know you've done it? Rather than saying, update me on it. How will I know you've done it? And then how will it feel when you succeed? So that people are left with that positive kind of experience and emotion at the end of the conversation. And then I've added a stage to the GROW model, which is the S, which is sustain it. So you might do this now, but then how will you do it again in the future if these situations come up? How will you sustain the progress in this conversation, or these actions that you're going to go forward and take? And then when we think further than that, what will you do to become self-sufficient next time or in future? So really starting to get people to not just think about that initial coaching conversation, but start to think beyond it. And that's really useful, because it starts to draw out from people, some ideas that they can use themselves to start to become much more self-sufficient. So that's my take on the GROW model, or GROW's model, as you might call it. Okay, that's my main share for this morning. So let me stop sharing my screen, and love to hear your feedback, Chris and Claire. What as I saw you taking a few notes. What were you thinking?
I was thinking I've got a coaching session later on today, so I've written down some of your questions. Sorry, Chris, I dived in there.
That's good. That's good. Thanks, Claire. So you've got a coaching session later with one of your team, or?
Yeah, I've got a coaching session with one of my team, and so the key questions that I was listening to all of it, but the things for me that I'm going to say are: what is your goal? What's your ideal outcome? What are you going to do differently?
Hmm. Well, and what's the is there a topic for the coaching conversation, Claire? Have they approached you with something?
Well, in our business, we have regular coaching, which is every 6 to 8 weeks. So we also have weekly shorter sessions. So there is a structure to follow, but this is really useful because we do have sales responsibilities.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. And is that so? Okay, so that's a nice rhythm. So you're having weekly short coaching conversations, and then every 6 to 8 weeks a longer coaching session with your team.
Yeah, that's sort of the guideline framework, and then obviously you might have ad hoc conversations in between, but this is really good structure for me. Thank you.
Pleasure. Well, I'd love to hear how you get on with it, Claire, because it's really interesting that as a model, it's sometimes you might have to tweak it with different people depending on the topic. And sometimes I'll find myself going goal, reality, reminding people of the goal, then go to options. So you can go forwards and backwards on it. It is a linear model, but you don't have to use it in a linear way. And depending on the person. And the other thing that's interesting, and this fascinates me a lot with the people I coach, is the amount of times you ask a question, they start the answer, and then they go off track. You end up somewhere completely different, and then you kind of come back to the question. And a lot of people I coach are pretty senior people, and I think it's really interesting that just that ability to have a model in your mind sometimes it's really useful for you in your coaching approach because it helps you to bring people back on track. Actually, let's go back to, so what was the desired outcome, or what was the ideal outcome? It's really interesting that sometimes people can't always do that for themselves because they're so caught up in the situation that they're talking about. Thanks, Claire. It's good.
There's a few things come out there for me. I think the first one is, that this can't be done in isolation. And when we look at the model that you use, all of those are the component parts. You can't just have a coaching conversation if we don't have the other things in place. That's really important as well, having that correct culture, etc.
Yeah.
And a coaching conversation can be event driven. So every 6 to 8 weeks, as Claire says, or 4 to 6 weeks, as I do them, there are these events which we calendarize, diarize, and people know they're coming to a coaching session, and we're going to talk about what they're working on and how they want to develop. We also have coaching conversations in the moment as well. So it should never just be viewed as an event. These conversations happen all the time.
Yeah.
And then the other one is not getting them mixed up with other types of conversations we have responsibility for, such as management conversations, conversations about performance, a mentoring session being very different as well. All of those play a part, but it's important that when you're having these conversations, both parties understand what type of conversation they're having.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you can go off track, and that looking at somebody with a blank expression, well, hold on, I'm here for a performance review, and you're trying to have a coaching conversation with me. Well, tell me what I've done wrong. Tell me what I need to improve, and then maybe we go to coaching conversation. You just got to make sure you get the balance right between them and understand in your own mind the purpose of them, and that contract between the two parties of this conversation is my responsibility as the leader of the business. I need to have this management conversation with you. Very different to the coaching conversation. I think on the grow model, yes, I use that extensively, and like you, I've added a couple of bits as well, but I've added a T and an H to the end. You cover the T in the will, so it's timelines, and it's not just when's this going to be done by, it's what are the milestones as well, because not everything gets done tomorrow. It might be in 2 years' time. This is what it looks like. So what does it look like 3 months' time, 6 months' time? What are those milestones? And then the H is help. What support do you need? What help do you need from me? Who else would you need to co-opt to help you get to this goal? Have you thought about those things? Do you need me to introduce you to people? What sort of conversations do you need to have? How would you tackle those conversations? What do you think the response would be? And really you just want them leaving the meeting, bang
Yeah.
onto your point, Justin, completely self-sufficient, because that's what coaching is. It's not, I'm going to do this, this, and this for you. It's, if to help me to achieve this, if you could do this bit for me, that would be great. But they need to leave there, knowing what the plan is, knowing what the support structure they need around it is, and how they're going to get it.
So you've got growth as your model then, Chris, with T&H.
Yeah, so I was thinking then growths, because I do like sustain. You're right, absolutely sustain, but growths just sounds a bit odd. You've got growths, you just did growths.
No, I like that.
Growth.
I really like the timelines and the help. I've heard growth before, but it was the T was tactics, and the H was, I can't remember what the H was, but it was tactics. Oh, habits, tactics and habits. Key tactics that you'll deploy, and how do you make it a habit going forward? So that was can't remember where I was on a program where someone had explained that they'd use the T&H, but I much prefer timelines and help, actually, much better.
And I'm not claiming that as my own. I've obviously picked that up somewhere along the way. Can't remember when. I remember studying growth many, many years ago. But sorry, grow many, many years ago. Something somewhere has just come into my thinking about the T and the H. Don't know where, don't know how. I haven't invented it myself. I've just stolen it. No copyright, right?
I like it. I like it. Well, if you've stolen it, I might steal it from you, Chris, if you don't mind.
Not an issue.
Because I like it. Yeah, I like it a lot. I think that's really good. So you've got and your other point, Chris, was really well made about having the right leadership styles for the right situation. Situational leadership, because there are times when coaching isn't the right approach, or at least coaching on its own is not the right approach. So as you say, directive management, almost performance reviews, and actually situations where you're leading your teams and you have to set a clear direction. That's when it calls for the more, I guess, more directive leadership approach. But I think the point you made also was as quickly as you can pivot to responsibility, giving responsibility or inspiring responsibility from the team, so that you're not the one left holding the responsibility. And that's the key.
Yeah, and I think you hear a lot of times early on in coaching conversation, before the coachee really gets it, well, what do you think? What would you do? You've got to back away from those questions, because it's not about what I would do, what I think that would be a mentoring session. It's about you, what you think you could try.
Yeah, for sure. And that can be a bit of a trap that we fall into, because the minute someone says, what do you think? It's really tempting, especially if you've got some ideas. But you're right, because you've got to avoid that. Largely, what I've found in my experience, where if someone says, what would you do? And I've told them, they then say, oh yeah, but that's all right because it's you. So, I can't do that because I'm not you. And there's this perception filter that we all have. And so unless you use that coaching approach, and once that's landed, then you say, well, what could you do? Then you've almost lost the argument or lost the conversation, because they've already built that resistance to, well, no, that's what you said. It's yours, not mine. Yeah. So it's interesting. I've had that reverse on me a few times. So keeping really clean on the coaching questions and conversations is really important. So what does this mean? So Clay, you've got a specific action going forward with your coaching conversation today?
This would be more helpful to structure, because as Chris knows, I can talk, and I have to remember to listen and ask key questions, and it's for the other person to do the talking and the thinking. So that's my challenge. Use some of these key questions, let the other person fill the space, not me.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to one of Justin's points in the slides there, Claire, is that session is not about us, it's about them. That hour and 15, hour and 30, whatever you carved out, that's their hour. It's for them, for their things. If you need things from it, you need to book a different time slot. You need to ask those things at a different time about, why is the calendar so empty? Why they're not making the calls? That doesn't come into that session, or shouldn't. It really is about them and helping them. Really disowning that time, because it's not yours, it's theirs.
Yeah. And that's not an easy thing to do.
Not in busy lives. You've got some time with your people. You've always got that urge to, I need to know this. Oh, I forgot to ask them that. What about this?
Yeah. And when you're under pressure, if there is a performance gap, and perhaps some of those topics that you just said do need addressing. Actually, it's about it's almost boundaries, isn't it? This is a coaching session about them, and there needs to be a review session about performance or some of the gaps that you and they are looking to improve upon. But creating that delineation between them. I think it's having coaching sessions with teams. I think that's a really forward-thinking thing to do in a business. That's not. I don't see that often. So I think that's a really positive thing for the culture that you've got within Westfield Health, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
The intent is there. Let's put it that way. But don't see them as sufficiently enough true coaching sessions. A lot of them are management conversations, but at least the culture's there to try and make sure that every line manager is having a conversation with the people, and there is that every employee knows there's a window of opportunity to have a coaching conversation, which is, I'll use the word mandated, but it's not like somebody's coming around with a whip, so, oh, you haven't done the session, but we do have a cadence that we recommend. It's just making sure we're having better coaching conversations rather than so many management conversations is the challenge. But for all the reasons we just spoke to.
Well, it's the way to keep helping people take greater responsibility, isn't it? And hopefully help your managers and leaders not to be continually having to pick things up for themselves, because that's the challenge for a lot of organizations. And a lot of organizations I work with, when we talk about building a coaching culture, part of the challenge is that people, well, at the start, they don't always have the knowledge and skills to be able to coach. So it's almost about going back to foundations and say, let's walk you through what it means, how we structure it. But even with that in place, then it's about, everybody understanding this is something that we want to work on and make, as you say, a cadence, a rhythm around having coaching conversations and design a culture that actually fosters greater responsibility, fosters this coaching style in leaders so that they can hopefully empower their teams more and not feel as if they're trapped in having to have all the answers. And I think that's what causes a lot of leadership and management stress, is that feeling, that nagging feeling that you've constantly got to have the answers. And there's no reason why we should have to know all the ins and outs of our employees' jobs and be able to help them to achieve what they can achieve. They're much better place to do that.
Yeah, and I think, and maybe Claire will correct me if she has it, or has a different view to me. We'll share her view. I joined 3 years ago, gone May, and when I saw that we have this cadence, we have this structure around coaching conversation, I was chuffed a bit, absolutely pleased. Never had that in an organisation before. It's been good practice, recommended. You pick it up as a skill as a leader, but it's never been as mandated as it is here and recorded. And then especially coming from a world of annual appraisals, that was the event. I forgot what they did in month 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. How the hell, so you're building your own cadence. So then to see it here, and one of the questions I asked was, this is great, but how do we then support it? Or we had a coach come in, train people on what coaching conversations look like. But that was probably 4 or 5 years ago it was set up, Claire. Were you around at the time? Yeah. And I think there hasn't been that sustained piece of then following up, training people on what coaching conversations look like, the importance of them. Talk to people about the challenges they have. I don't think that's in the business, and that's a little action I've taken away to talk to the business about. Maybe we need to revisit that again and make sure that people are comfortable, because we'll have new managers, we'll have leaders join us, people who've been promoted, etc., and may just be following what their previous manager did, which could be brilliant, could be world class, or it could be just what they saw somebody else do. So definitely something worth revisiting.
Yeah, and it's almost like just bringing people back to fundamentals, isn't it? Like we do in these sessions here, right? So just giving people the structure that they can follow, because very often, even if you know it, we don't always follow through on what we know. We might know it but don't do it, and I think that's another thing that I experience a lot people will kind of have the intellectual knowledge. I know I should be coaching, and I know there is a grow model, but then they find themselves slipping into, because it's easier in the moment and they default to just telling people what to do and moving on. And then they're like, oh, I should have had that as a coaching conversation. And just bringing people back to some of these fundamentals and getting them to say, okay, I'm going to make a commitment from here to start coaching again with my teams. And I'm going to have a conversation with them about how and why we do that, and just bring it back to people's conscious awareness so they can actually make a commitment to do something.
I thought it was good what Chris said as well about types of conversations, because sometimes, now that you mention it, I think I might have done that in the coaching sessions, because I kind of like list what people have achieved to try and make them feel better, and then I like shoehorn in the tiny bit that they're not doing so well to try to get them talking about that. And I think I might have been doing them a little bit more like a school report, or almost like a KPI report, rather than a proper in-depth conversation, actually. So that's a good tip.
Yeah, I separate the two things out. We have a portal that we use, Justin, called People Hub, where we log our coaching one-to-one conversations, and there's various sections in there. So in the manager's comments, Claire, that's where I put the KPIs and what's been achieved, etc.
Right.
In the reviewer's comments, that's where I put in the coaching conversation notes, etc. And then pick up on any actions that are within the other bits of the document, etc.
Yeah. So you've got two areas specifically where they live, and you can update them.
Yeah, and sometimes during the coaching one-to-one, we don't even talk about those KPIs or those achievements. They just haven't come up. We've had just a genuine, thorough 1 hour 15, 1 hour 20-minute coaching conversation. But
Brilliant.
the detail still gets recorded. As you know, they say it, I say it, HR sees it. They never want to look at it. Don't think they ever do. But, imagine if they did. All that useful information.
Chris, do you do, well, I don't know if anybody in any of the businesses does this, but in our team, they encourage you to have what they call a skip one. So maybe once or twice a year, rather than having your coaching session with your direct line manager, you might have it with like your department head, or somebody even from another department who's senior, who's got more experience. And that can feel a little bit daunting at first, but actually it's really useful, because you just get someone that you're maybe not talking to every single day of the week, and get a different type of conversation and a different view. But I think we don't have a KPI on that, but I think they like you to do it about once a year minimum.
Yeah, so Tony used to do it with my direct reports. It was new to me. It wasn't something that I experienced in a previous organisation. But I never felt it was structured enough. It was more conversation. It was a catch up, how things going, anything I can do to help, rather than any form of coaching to it. It was just a much more of a conversation. And you and I both know Tony, wonderful bloke and a really good line manager. But he was coming at it from not the correct point of view, in my opinion. And it was more conversational. But if it's different in your area, then great. Yeah, it's a lot of benefit. And the things like the mentorship programs that we have in Westfield as well, I think are really good, just to get you into a different conversation with different people and share different knowledge.
I think that's a great initiative. The other thing I guess it's useful for is also it keeps the team connected with not only their manager, but the manager above them, which I think, it's really good, because sometimes there's that anxiety in an organization of the senior leaders, and that's a really good way to break that anxiety down and just create a connection amongst people and their boss's boss. And I remember when I was first I was at 3M, and I was first in there, and I saw the MD, and the MD was, I had a sales manager, he had a general sales manager, there was a business unit director, and then there was the MD. So he was like 5 positions above me. And I remember the first time I ever met him feeling really nervous, and I couldn't work out why I felt so nervous. It's because he just appeared to be so far up the chain. And actually over time, when you get to know those people and you realize that you can either, you can reach out to them, you can send them an email, you can call them, you can get some time with them. That really does help build your connection with the organization and helps you feel part of, something bigger, knowing that you can, access those people. So I think that as an initiative is a really good idea.
Yeah, I think post-COVID hybrid working is even more important, Justin. I wasn't at Westfield pre-COVID, but it was office-based organisation. the board, the executive would walk the floors, and they still do. They still walk the floors when they come in. They make sure they go around, say hi to everybody, so they're visible, etc. But there's not that many people in now. The office is very, you know, we've gone from what, 9 floors to 1.5 now, Claire. Just because we have a hybrid work from anywhere, you know, get your outcome oriented view, which is good and works for people. But it must be difficult for the likes of Dave and Jason, our CEO, CFO, etc., to, when they don't see people as much, and they are open to, as I say, just walking the floors is a big difference, you know. Make sure when we come in and leave at the end of the day. So yeah. Post COVID, I think that's important.
Yeah. Well, they used to talk about was it management by walk, MBWA, wasn't it? Management by walkabout. Yeah. So basically, as managers, it's creating some time in your diary on a regular basis, you know, certainly weekly, sometimes maybe even daily, just to walk around the departments, walk and see your teams and spend some time talking to them, because that connection helps people feel part of something bigger than just their role and just the business. They know the leaders in the organization. And I'm like you know, at 3M, there was a lot of that happened. You know, you'd see the senior managers walking around, and, you know, lunchtimes they'd be in the restaurant, and, you know, just trying to be present so that if people wanted to talk to them, they could. And, you know, that it's the little things like that also make quite a difference, especially if they're interested and they're prepared to, you know, listen and ask questions. You almost take a coaching approach. That's good. Well, thanks for the conversations this morning, Claire and Chris. Really enjoyed that. Let's you'll know a couple of these things. I wanted to share something this morning that I thought was useful. I love this principle. Always, I heard this a long time ago. I don't think it was this exact quote, but I remember hearing this principle that it's believed that the average person uses no more than 10% of his or her potential. Sometimes you see that in your teams. You think this person's got so much more potential. They're literally scratching the surface of what they're capable of. And, you know, there's all these unexplored gifts and talents that people have. And if they don't start to cultivate them and use them, then they lose them. And for me, this really does kind of help to solidify why coaching is so important, because in those coaching conversations, and especially if you're doing it in a regular cadence and rhythm, that is brilliant. You start to help people unlock higher levels of that potential that they could be tapping into. And, you know, it's interesting that this says 10%. And then the other evidence is that the way the mind works is that it goes on repeat with the way it thinks 90% of the time. What that means for our teams is they tend to go back to, well, this is how I do this. This is how I do this. Even if that's not right, they'll go back to doing things the way they've always done them. And coaching is the way to break free of that, unlock more potential, shift from just doing the same things over and over, and start to think more differently in the conversations that we have with them as leaders. And then, you know, about this leadership success. So I'm a real fan of thinking about safe places for confidential conversations, which you're creating with your teams, and hopefully you've got that for yourselves. A community of business leaders that are going through the same thing as you, so you can start to share ideas and collaborate, which is the third point. And then having someone to challenge the way that you think, just so it gives you that continual evolution of the ideas, and making a commitment to do something about it once you've had those ideas kind of come to you. I always share this. This will be on the email as well. If you are interested in a chat, a one-to-one, then feel free to book into my diary. Just let me send you that on the chat here. Entirely kind of coaching focused conversation. It's normally about you, your business, if there's something specific you're working on, or sometimes people will contact me about like maybe a career discussion, or even just a discussion about, you know, some of their areas for leadership development and what they could be working on. So if that would be useful, please feel free to get in touch. I think that's everything for today. Any final questions or comments from Claire, from you or Chris about today, or anything else that you're thinking of?
No, thanks. I've got loads of notes, so I'm just going to pick out my key questions for later on today. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Claire. Thanks for joining us. Chris, anything?
No, just, you know, the GROW model was revolutionary for me as a leader, just to have that structure, just those 4 things to focus on. That's all you need to do. Just ask questions in those 4 areas. It's not linear. It can be linear. Maybe it needs to be, maybe it doesn't need to be. It doesn't matter. Just ask those questions in those areas. You'll have a great coaching conversation.
Yeah, agreed. And once you know it, once it becomes habit for you, then you can add, additional questions, timelines, any help that you need. I love those additions from today. Thank you for sharing them, Chris. No, great. Well, thanks, Claire. Thanks, Chris. I hope you both have a wonderful weekend. Thank you for joining us. So next week is next week's topic, I think, is delegation. So I'm going to talk about delegation next week. That's the last workshop for a while, because then I'm away. I'm doing a bucket list holiday in September. My wife and I are going to Vancouver and then Alaska. So we're doing
beautiful.
Flying to Vancouver, then cruise ship up through Alaska, inside channel, see the icebergs and the whales and stuff, then back down, then the Rocky Mountain tour. So we're probably away for, I think it's about 17 or 18 days. So it's quite a big trip. So I won't be back then until October. So next week will be the last one for probably about a month. And I'm also going to use that thinking time to work out, because I do these every week, actually, will I start to move these to monthly? So from October, last session next week, which will be the first week in September, from there, I think I'm going to move these out to monthly, but I'll keep you both posted. I've got your emails, and I'll keep you on the email thread if that's okay. And yeah, good luck with your coaching conversations. Thanks for your support on these sessions, and may see you next week. If not, have a great weekend.
Thank you. Good luck with your tickets tomorrow.
Enjoy your trip. Take care.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Take care. See you. Bye.